because we're going to talk about the Santa Lucia Highlands. We're going to show you the new map that Alessandro Masnaghetti and our team, we've been working on for a while now. It's, I think, the most in-depth map of this area ever, especially in its orientation, which we'll talk about in a second. And we have an unbelievable panel here. So I would encourage you to ask questions, because that way we can weave them into the conversations. You know, sometimes we've done these, we get all the questions at the end and it's like, we can't get to them all. So ask the questions now, please. It's really rare to have this incredibly illustrious group of people on at the same time. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce the panel, then I'm going to show you the map, and then we're just going to get started, but please give us your questions. So, we really have the icons of the Santa Lucia Highlands here. So first of all, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for sharing your insights with us this afternoon. And thank you for everything that you've done to help us do this map. So we have Gary Francioni. Gary, thanks for being here. Adam Lee.
Hey.
And then the formidable father and son team, Gary and Jeff Pizzoni. Thanks for being here. So we've been working on this map for a while now, and I'm going to show you what we've been up to. Really, you're the first first folks that we've shown this to, because this is very much the first time that we've really put it up. Let's see if this works. Is that coming through nicely?
Yep, looks good.
So the map of the Santa Lucia Highlands, and I'm going to move it like this so we don't make the boxes of the speakers too small. But this is a map of the Santa Lucia Highlands, and I'm going to just zoom it in a little bit like this, just so everybody can see the macro view first. And the first thing is the orientation of this land, which we'll come back to in a second. Before we get into too much of the detail, before I forget, because I'm sometimes forgetful, I want to just remind everybody of where we are, because I think sometimes with some viticultural areas, it's not always easy to have reference. So in this little call out here, we can see this is San Francisco, obviously. And so we're about 2 hours south by car. And I think, one of the things about the Santa Lucia Highlands is its location. Obviously, we'll talk about that in a second. But I remember the first time that I went out to taste the wines, I was just struck by how different it was from all the other regions that get lumped into this term that I got rid of as soon as it was shown to me, because I thought it was not very helpful, was the Central Coast. When I first started reviewing these wines, 2010, 2011, this was part of the Central Coast. And the first time I went out there, I was like, God, this place is completely different from all the places that I've been around that are also called the Central Coast. And that was the beginning of trying to understand, why do these wines taste this way? And what is it about this land that's unique? And some of you may know that my parents had a wine shop when I was a kid. We sold a ton of Mercelet Chardonnay. We had one customer in particular who just loved it. And this was sort of the beginnings of my awareness of this area. So here we are, we're 2 hours south of San Francisco. We're close to the ocean, and that's sort of the macro view. And then if we want to sort of zoom in a little bit more closely, you can sort of see that while we're close to the ocean, this is the vineyard area here in sort of pinkish. And then here we can sort of get a sense of where we are next to Monterey, for example, and the mountain ranges that are surrounding. So you're sort of in a strip of land close to the ocean, but also with mountains. And I'll show you the big view before we start to get into history. But this is the Santa Lucia Highlands. When you drive by here, you're on 101, which is sort of here. And the reason it's not on this map is just because there's a lot of land here. But 101 would basically be here. And so when you're driving, one of the things is, and guys, please jump in if I get this wrong, because I'm talking about your area that you guys know a million times better than me. So if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense, don't be shy. So please don't be shy. But basically, when you're driving by, you have the impression of more of an east-west kind of an orientation, because you're sort of driving on the road, and the vineyards they appear to be sort of parallel. I guess they are parallel, but you're going really this way. And so the first thing that we wanted to do is really show the true north-south of this area. And so as you're driving north, you're really driving northwest. And I think that that's really important, because there's a difference between at least to me, there's a difference between the southern part of the Santa Lucia Highlands and the northern part of the Santa Lucia Highlands, which is hopefully one of the many themes that we'll explore this afternoon. So this is the map, and I'll just show you a few just really basic features before we get into the history of this region. So for starters, I'll show you just the general view. So here's the Salinas River. So as I said, 101 would be over here. And then these, one of the features about the Santa Lucia Highlands is that this is River Road. So this is the road that you drive past, that people who've been to the region drive through pretty frequently over here. And you're pretty quickly at elevation. So you're starting off 100 feet, 200 feet. And then you have all of these this mountain range over here. The dotted line is the AVA. So a lot of this area is outside the AVA, and it's obviously not planted because all of the vineyards are here, but it's a feature of the landscape that I think is important. And I'll ask the panel to explain in more detail, but you can see that we get, if I can zoom in here properly, you get up to 1,000 feet in elevation around here. And you can see the contours that Alessandro has drawn. Alessandro is our cartographer. He's done all of ththose great Barolo and Barbaresco maps that people love, plus our Napa Valley maps. And I think he's just an inspired artist. So this is his drawing. So that's kind of an overview, just sort of a general overview. But I think it might be instructive to have sort of a historical look at this region, how it was born. I'm sitting here, I noticed I have this is a Pizzoni 20th anniversary wine. So we're talking about a region that is in the global scale of wine pretty young, and so I think it would be interesting to learn about its history. So why don't we start, Gary Francioni, first with you, and then we'll go down to the Pizzonis. Tell us about the birth of this region, how it came to be.
Thanks, Antonio. I'm a third generation farmer, and in the late 1800s, 1886, my family came from Switzerland and Italy through Ellis Island, and then, like many of the families in the region, migrated west and settled in the Salinas Valley and the Highlands. They farmed dairies, and over decades, different row crops. But really, the Highlands, as I remember in high school, and say 1973, was really grazing land and cattle and little spots of small white bean planting, sugar beets, potatoes. But in 1973, the first vineyards were planted by Jerry McFarland, Rich Smith, and Nicky Hahn, who was also a Swiss-German immigrant. He bought a horse ranch, which was called Smith and Hook, and they literally boarded horses up there. And everybody thought he was crazy when he cleared off these steep mountains and terrain and planted vines. But they really were the pioneers of our region. And then in the 80s, born out of that Hahn family was Steve McIntyre, who started his viticulture career there. He purchased his own vineyard and farmed a lot of vineyards, developed a lot of vineyards in the region. In the 80s, also, a famous vineyard, Sleepy Hollow, was developed by Rob Talbot, who was actually a tie maker. And Gary Pizzoni started planting the Pizzoni estate. He had like 4 acres, and he was trucking water up there. I'm sure he'll tell you that story. So those were kind of the mid-range, but I really feel the gold rush was the 1990s. And you had a really impactful player like Chuck Wagner come into the area from Napa. And when we saw that Napa, quote, money come into town, we said, we might have something special here. And so he was drawn to the beauty of the area, and he naturally planted Mercelet. Dan Lee from Oregon came in and planted Double L. Gary and I planted the Gary's Vineyard. I planted Rosellas. Ray Francioni planted several vineyards. Also, who came into play during that time was Mondavi family out of Napa. And they put together a large planting at that time. So that all this credibility started building in the 90s. What really, I think, put a lot of another stamp on our region was our outside wineries that come in when people like Siduri, Testarossa, Minor, Costa Brown, Patson Hall, Peter Michael, Bernardus, players out of the area that came in and wanted to make wine from our region was very impactful for us. And if I can just skate into the 2000s, we had another splattering of vineyards come in from outsiders. John Peterson is a tax attorney, and he had the vision and the love for Santa Lucia Highlands that came in and wanted to be here, and he bought property. We've had larger outfits as well, Gallo, Delicato. We've had also some more Swiss Italians come in with heritage of farming. The Caraccioli family, he was a big asparagus grower, and he wanted to make sparkling. That was his dream. We've had some local people, farmers like Kirk Williams, who's a citrus farmer. He dabbled in it to it. So it's been really and also in the 2000s, we had some more brands come in and just really wanted to be part of the SLH, Red Stitch and Walt and Wrath, and just everybody wanted to be part of it. It was really fun.
Wow. That's like an incredibly great history in just a few minutes, much better than I could certainly do. I'd love to hear from Gary Pizzoni. What were you witnessing during these times?
When I started collecting wine in college in 1975, and I had so much fun making it that I wanted to plant a vineyard. And I used to grow vegetables with my father. We were partners, and but it didn't feel like partners because we had to do everything his way. And finally, I talked him into planting some grapes, and he says, "Aren't you satisfied? We farm 1,000 acres, lettuce, asparagus, celery, broccoli, tomatoes, cauliflower. What do you want to plant grapes on that horse ranch for?" I said, "Dad, have you ever been invited to a $250 black tie lettuce tasting?" And then he kind of got it, but it still took a few years. And I was kind of a cowboy, and I was riding horses, but I get bucked off a lot, so that wasn't too good. And so, but I've had so much fun with grapes because I was making wine, and with my sons, started making wine in 1978, and Jeff used to help me make the wine and would pump it back and forth, and it won a lot of awards and it turned out pretty good, but I didn't really know what I was doing. So I wanted my son to major in enology in college. And then he took it to another level. And I planted at the Pizzoni Vineyard. I have a special clone that I got in Burgundy, and I can't really say where I got it from, but it's a very special one. And I started with 300 plants and I propagated to 50,000. And it turned out real good. And then I have a partner named Gary Francione who's on here, and we planted the Gary's Vineyard together with this special clone, and it turned out really nice. And we didn't know what to name it, but I said, "Hey, we're both named Gary. Let's name it Gary's." So we planted the Gary's Vineyard. Then we planted the Sobranis Vineyard right next to it. And my son's involved with the making of the wine, and Gary's sons just came of age, and they're helping with the viticulture and the making of the wine. So it's a special partnership because, well, Gary and I have been friends since we were little kids and went to high school together, and our parents did the same thing together. And I want to congratulate Antonio on what a great job he did on this map, because we really did need an update. And Adam Lee has been a special friend of ours for years and been making wine from Santa Lucia Highlands, and got a magic touch for wine. It always turns out great. But
hey, Gary, I saw this the other day and it reminded me of you. Wine, because no great story started with a salad. So
that's about right.
Did you send samples to Adam? Did you have wine you were making at home? How did you and Adam, to share more Santa Lucia Highlands history as well, connect initially?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how we got started. I think I
wrote letters. You called me, Gary. You had wine. You tied the Siduri wine that I make down at the cheese shop, and you called me and asked me to come down there. And what I didn't realize was I was coming to your house, not to the vineyard. So I was trying to figure out where the vines were, and your house is more on the valley floor where, they're vegetables. I mean, the directions, you turn right at the second asparagus field and left at the cauliflower and that kind of thing. I'd come up and try to figure out, and we end up going into your barn and tasting what you had made for that year's consumption, which might have violated the legal limit as far as how many barrels you were supposed to have in that barn at the time. But we tasted quite a few bottles of wine and then went downstairs and tasted into the cellar. I had 1970 Haut-Brion along with a few other things. And I was convinced I was buying from you long before I even saw the vineyard at that point in time. So,
well, it was a good combination.
Yep.
Before we hear more from Adam Lee, I just want to tell Gary Francione and Gary Pizzoni that you guys have pissed off writers and editors for years with this vineyard that has the apostrophe at the end.
Wine list, right?
Wine list, Psalms. Everybody is Gary's with the apostrophe S.
Everybody that works in the cellar too, Antonio, you know, all my interns and stuff, they would label stuff and I'd have to make them go through and redo the barrel tags.
So I just had to get that out of the way.
Yep.
All right, cool. So, Adam, tell us more. I mean, so you started making Siduri wines, and there's a famous story, right? You dropped off a bottle for a really famous critic at a hotel, and that was the beginning of Siduri, right?
That was the beginning. Yes, I took a sample over to Robert Parker back in 1995, their 94 vintage, first vintage of Siduri. I managed to drink a little bit too much that night and became emboldened, and probably the best drunk decision I've ever made in my life. I made a lot of them and they haven't turned out as well as that particular one did. So that was the beginning. And then 97 was the first year going down to the Santa Lucia Highlands. So just a few years after that, and meeting Gary, and then meeting Gary Francione as well, and getting into the Gary's Vineyard in 99 and Rosella's just 2 years after that. So I've been down there for 20 plus years now.
And that was Morro Bay. That was when Bob used to stay at Morro Bay.
Yep, that is correct. That is correct. It was down in Morro Bay, and we would go down there and do tastings with him. And if we had the opportunity, we'd have dinner down there too. It was fun.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I mean, it looks like it turned out pretty well. So excellent. All right, cool. Well, this is a visually striking part of California, and one of its features is the proximity to the ocean and also the influence of fog. So, Gary Francione, I'm curious. Explain to us first of all, the temperature. Temperature is very unique there. The growing season is very unique, and it's very tied to this relationship with fog. So, for folks who don't know or who are just sort of interested in learning more or exploring the region, how does that all work where you are? Because it's really very unique.
It is, Antonio, and we're just fortunate to be near Monterey Bay. I typically believe or tell the story that around 10 o'clock at night, the fog rolls in off the bay, down the valley floor, and then up the mesa, which is the Highlands. And it'll come into the north, naturally, northwest, as you say, and work its way east. And so it may take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes to get from the north to the south. And then it has to go up the hill. So, and then after it rolls at 10 o'clock in the morning, it'll roll off the mesa into the valley floor and out to the Monterey Bay. And there again, from south to north, it may take 30 to 60 minutes to get off of that. So if you really look at the degree days in the growing season, you could possibly get, an hour a day of more fog in the north and the south, just because the proximity to the bay.
So can I interrupt you for a second for people who are watching who may not know what that means? That is the summation of temperatures between bud break and harvest, correct? The growing season.
Correct.
Yeah. So that's a heat summation during the and it's really the heat summation above a certain average, I believe, is the real technical measurement of that, or a baseline. But what is that? So that's what the degree days are. This is a picture of Pizzoni you can see blanketed by the fog. So what does that do to temperatures exactly? Because Santa Lucia Highlands, the three main grapes are Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Syrah. So how does this affect those varieties?
Well, as you can see, you're exactly right. The fog gets into Pizzoni, which is the furthest south or next to the further south site. So the whole appellation is cool. Probably the differences down south are the soils. You have more decomposed granite versus more sandy loam in the north.
So does that mean the differences between north and south are mostly about soil, or is it mostly about climate also?
I think it's a combination, but I think if you had to pick one, it'd probably be soil, because that's not going to move on you. Back to your question on the varietals. I mean, I think that's one of the real true benefits of Santa Lucia Highlands is that it has natural acidity because of its proximity and the fog and soil types. So very rarely do we ever have to acidify our wines because we have so much natural acid. And there's many times where we have to wait for I have to wait for the acid to drop before we harvest.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really interesting. So here we are. So the north would be here, I guess, northwest. We're all, I mean, look, I'm guilty of this too. We're going to have to all kind of like change the way we talk about things a little bit, because this is really northwest here. Gary's is here, Soberon is here. What is the difference between the various vineyards, Gary, that you have? Is you have quite a few. You have, whereas the Pizzonis have their estate down here in the south, you have vineyards in a lot of different places. You have Sierra Mar here. You've got things that are more central. You've got your home vineyard, Rosellas. What is the difference between those places for people who are used to seeing, this on a label? Because I think it's one of the coolest things about the Santa Lucia Highlands is the vineyard designate wine. So, like, what are the signatures of Rosellas, for example?
Well, Rosellas is my furthest north vineyard, and it's really feminine, rose petal, more red raspberries, red cherry flavors, versus as you just go 2 miles away, I mean, you have microclimates. 2 miles away to Gary's, we get more blueberries and more colas. And as you go down to Sierra Mar, Pizzoni, you get more blackberries and more tannins. The vineyards show themselves because we farm them the same. And we have the same people year round, and really the sites show themselves.
Yeah, so here's your home vineyard, Rosellas. Here's Gary's, here's Soberanas, and here's Sierra Mar down here. Down here. And one of the things, I remember I've been to Pizzoni obviously a few times, and especially to work on this map. But Jeff, this is just your own vineyard, itself is really very varied here. So, I mean, that was the first thing I noticed when I went there, was just trying to grasp your ranch is really hard, because you have lots of different sectors. You make wine, you also sell fruit to a bunch of other people. What are the key signatures of your vineyard besides that famous clone from that famous vineyard in Von Romane that you're not supposed to?
Well, I think, what maybe makes it, special to us is that diversity in there. And with the Santa Lucia Highlands, especially in these southern terroirs of it, and, using, Pizzoni as an example, you have these different alluvial fans and such a very different topography. And you have, as the formation of the Santa Lucia Highlands came up with what's the Release Fault, which lifted up that mountain range, these alluvial fans started drifting down. So in some cases, you have a lot of different soil types, and as is the case here at Pizzoni. And, from a winemaking point of view, which, as a winemaker, which I love and appreciate, from Dad's initial farming approach as a winemaker's perspective, we farm each of those specific and enjoy, carving out these individual blocks to, show that different distinct terroir, different sites. So you could have a ridge, you could have a valley, you could have some terraces, and each one is, very specific, and it's complex, but very distinct among all the blocks.
And is it the same clone propagated, the 50,000 plants that your dad references, that the whole ranch planted with the same clone, or do you have other things in there?
Yeah, it is. We have a little bit of Chardonnay and a little bit of Syrah, but it's essentially 90% Pinot Noir in these different blocks.
Okay,
with elevation, I'd also point out from a winemaking vine physiology point of view that you have the fog layer, which is often about 1,000 feet. And when you get to some of the higher elevation vineyards, you have the different characteristics. You have some sunshine at the level of fog. So sometimes you have a pocket of fog where you still might get some sun, but feel these cooling effects from the fog. So you're retaining acidity into the lower temperatures, but you're getting sunlight for that phenolic development in the berries.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that ranch is just, it merits its own, I got to go a few more times. I can't really quite grasp it yet. I have to be perfectly honest with you.
Antonio, one of the things I remember when Gary Pizzoni and I and Francione, we were doing a wine dinner in New York, actually in New Jersey, and Gary Pizzoni was talking at the time about the different sections of the vineyard, but instead of calling them the Tina's section, the Big Block section, the Elias section, he would call them the Tina's Vineyard, the Elias Vineyard, the Big Block Vineyard. And to me, that was just really indicative of how each section was farmed as its own separate vineyard and thought of. If you have that mentality that you think of the different sections as their own vineyard, you treat them uniquely designed to make the best wine from that particular section. And that meant a lot, I think, just that expression, using those words.
Yeah, I know when Alessandro and I went out the last time, I was like, wow, this is like a whole world here. Because, it'd be very interesting if you could take like a vineyard from like Europe, Burgundy or Italy or whatever, and superimpose it on this map. I mean, you would see lots of this area is much bigger than a lot of vineyards put together in other parts of the world. And so that's, I think, what we were picking up on. We have a lot of people on the call and some fantastic questions, but I want to ask you, Adam Lee, one question before we take questions from our audience, which is, having just tasted your new wine, Clarice, when you made the Siduri wines, those wines became very popular because they were very fruity and very dense and very lush. And the Clarice wines have a lot of whole cluster and more aromatic. And so now you've made wines in a real wide gamut of styles, but from the same places. So what is the difference between working, let's say, to make a wine that's more sort of forward and luscious versus a wine that has a lot of whole cluster, but from the very same places? Do the farming dates?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and something that when I started up Clarice just a couple of years ago, 2017 was the first vintage there. It had dawned on me that as the vines had gotten older and had matured more, things were changing a bit. And in my ability to make the wine in a somewhat different way, it existed now. The vines allowed me to do that. When vines are very, very young, years ago, Tom Rocchioli, before I even started making wine, said, when you have very young vines, you take them riper than you normally would, because what you can't get in complexity, maybe you can make up for in just pure effusive forward fruit character. In so many places, when I started out making Pinot Noir in the mid 90s, those were younger vines. California Pinot, a lot of those vineyards were not planted or had just recently been planted at that point in time. They were very, very new. And now as the vines have gotten older, it allows me to do some different things in the vineyards. I'm picking a bit earlier than I used to. I'm taking different sections and picking them at the same time. So at both the Rosella's vineyard and the Gary's vineyard, I have two different sections that usually ripen 10 days apart. And instead, I'm picking them simultaneously to try to make one wine out of that. There's some of the flavors are maybe a little more ripe and some of them are a little bit less ripe, but kind of doing a field blend in that way. And then doing a lot more stems and trying to build in a little more tannic backbone in these wines also.
I mean, I just think that that's one of the most interesting things, is to see how you've made wines that are completely like very different stylistically from the same places. It really invites the question of like, what is the essence of these places, and these are questions that you could talk about for hours at a $250 not lettuce dinner.
Yes.
I love that. That's great. We've got some really cool questions. One is from Linda, which is about the fog. And she's asking, is the fog rolling in now less than before? We don't get near the fog days we used to down south here. Has climate change impacted the relationship of fog to this land, or is that complete? Is the influence of the fog something more about location that doesn't really, to the ocean, that's not so climate change sensitive? How about Gary Francione? What's your view?
That's correct. 10 years ago, I didn't believe in climate change, but I've come to change my feelings about that topic. And I can't remember, a couple of years ago, we had a really nice foggy summer growing season, but it was a dry fog. It wasn't that damp moisture fog. And it was then that I started believing that, that we do have some climate change. Naturally, we've been in some droughts, that there's no denying that. But Santa Lucia Highlands only gets 12 to 14 inches of rain a year anyway. But when we're getting the droughts, we're in that 5-inch range. But yeah, Antonio, yes, it is changing. It is changing the area. It's one of the reasons I planted an acre of Grenache at Sierra Mard, because I felt if climate change really happens, my kids will know 20, 30 years from now that they will be planted all in Grenache. But right now we're still Pinot positive.
Got it. I think we've got a couple of, that's a really, I mean, I think it's a fascinating thing to contemplate. We've got a couple questions more about soil. So I'm going to see if I can zoom this map properly, because a couple of folks have asked for like more detail on the soils. So I'm wondering if we could get into a little bit more, take a little bit deeper dive on the terrain and what the principal soil types are and how they change throughout the area. Maybe Jeff Pizzoni, you want to tackle this one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. One of the things that's, so the soils are primarily, as Gary Francioni mentioned too, decomposed granite. And that changes some as you go north to south. But one of the things that I think is interesting, or soil characteristic, what that lends to the wines of the region, is that the soil is very gravelly. It doesn't hold a lot of moisture. So as if one irrigates or rainfall comes down, as Gary said, we get about 12 inches of rain per year, which is not a lot. That water leaches through fast, which leads the vines to be working under very stressful conditions and working hard. But the decomposed granite soil, it also, with California's geologic history, the Santa Lucia Highlands originated in Southern California, if we go back just to speak to the interest of the region, because there's very little decomposed granite in the coastal ranges. So this was, if you took the southern end of the Sierra Nevadas in Southern California, in terms of geologic formation, which about 20 some odd million years ago when the San Andreas shifted everything north, is where the San Andreas was, where the Santa Lucia Highlands were then uplifted. So decomposed granite, but really gravelly soils, and I think about wine characteristics. I think about vines that work very hard in soils with low organic content and low moisture.
So, but how does the composition change as you go, let's say from where you are up northwest? Is the soil get more compact, less compact? Does the composition change, or is it more about the way that the land sort of tilts and the altitudes of different sites that drive the styles of the wines?
Yeah, so it's shallower soils in the southern end, more decomposed granite, schist, gneiss, quartz.
Down here where you are.
Yeah, and as you work your way farther north, you have, it's decomposed granite, but you have more, it's more sandy, you have more clays, you have a little bit more organic content.
Okay, so with sandier soils, is that to sort of link the two things that you talked about and what Gary Francioni talked about? Is that why the wines in the north have that more floral red fruit character, because there's more soils, generally sandier soils, more aromatic wines in most parts of the world?
Yeah, you have deeper root systems. You have vines that have a little bit more growth to them compared to the south, where you have shallower soils. Your vines are, more stressed. We see smaller clusters in the south, and we see slightly larger clusters in the north, and you get kind of different extraction profiles, different tannin concentrations, and different profiles flavor-wise as a result too.
Okay, so if we wanted to generalize, we would say the wines in the more northern sectors are more perfumey, more red fruit, and a little bit lighter in structure because of the soils being a little bit lighter, and the vines being deeper. And when you go south, the vines are stressed, the soils are more compact, they're shallower, smaller bunches, more tannins, darker fruit profile, more concentration, more or less?
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
So that's really helpful because, I think there's so many places where there's wine now, and I think to have a couple of rules of thumb, I think is really helpful. So that's cool. Let's see what else. We have a ton of.
Antonio, one of the things that was asked about, I saw it there, was somebody asked about Santa Rita. And since I get fruit for Syrah, I've gotten stuff from Santa Barbara all the way up to Oregon, actually, over the years. one of the things that I think we haven't really touched on much here is the wind and the effect of the wind in the Santa Lucia Highlands. I know that to a large extent, Gary and Rosella Francione named the winery Roar because of the roar of the winds that come into the area. And this is the only place that I get fruit from that it is not uncommon for it to be warmer at 1 o'clock in the afternoon than it is at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And really, as the Central Valley warms up, it acts kind of as this giant vacuum cleaner. And the Central Valley is further, I mean, you said 101 is a ways off the map. It's way over there. It pulls in the wind off of the Monterey Bay. I have had my car door blow shut on me several times, trying to open it up and get out of the car to go check vineyards in the afternoon. It just is that windy, and that really kind of shuts down the vines and allows for a very long hang time also in that area.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I'm glad you answered that because I sure as hell couldn't. It's great. What about, we've got a couple of questions about how vineyards are designed and vine orientation. How do you decide what, you guys have collectively planted quite a few vineyards. How do you make that decision about how to orient the vines in this land? Gary Francione.
That's a great question. Truthfully, some of it's been trial and error. We've been doing this for over 25 years, and we've planted, as Pizzonis have, 2 small little sections, 2 or 4 acre blocks, and we're always tweaking because you can only plant a vineyard once, and that's one of the reasons we planted Sobranis, was to make a great vineyard like Gary's even better. And so we tweaked and planted true north-south, and to try and get more even ripening with the apex of the sun. But we found out that the wind is such a benefit to us. We have 20 AccuSpore releases a year. And so we're a high mildew pressure area because we're near that Monterey Bay. And really, at 1 o'clock, when that wind roars through there, it really dries out the vines from the fog in the morning. And that's really beneficial. So some of us like the orientation to be up and down the valley with the wind blowing through to dry out the vines. Because the true north-south vineyards, we're finding that we are getting a little more botrytis because we don't have that dryness of airflow.
So you would plant instead how exactly?
I call it valley north, like parallel with River Road or 101.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
but yet we're still, Antonio, we're still experimenting every time we plant a piece or a vineyard. We're tweaking it. And even within the vineyards, we're tweaking it.
Yeah, and that's why you drive by, you see the vineyards look sort of parallel to the road, more or less, in a lot of places.
Yeah, that was probably the old days.
It's just fascinating. There's several questions about the future plantations. So how much more land is possible to develop here? You're smiling at him, so you must know something.
No, I think there's not an awful lot of land that can be developed. I just look at it, and it is a fairly small area. I mean, it's about 1 mile wide and 16-ish miles long, and it's limited at the very top. There's a lot of federal land. You can't really go above that, and it might not work. And then you go down on the valley floor, and it's too fertile. It's amazing growing land, but not grape growing. I think it's going to be very limited as to what can come out of here over the years.
Okay.
I don't know if Gary and Jeff feel differently, but I think that's
the boundaries of the appellation are very tight and well defined due to the alluvial fans establishing those boundaries. But also over half that appellation is planted into citrus. So that limits the amount of vineyard land that could be planted there.
Okay. So how many acres are under vine right now, most recently?
I believe it's 5,500.
5,500. Okay, so that's not so great. Not so huge. We have a question about irrigation. I think this is a really interesting question. What are the techniques that are used to irrigate these vineyards, and do they change a lot from place to place? Or are you dealing with sort of conditions that are consistent to most vineyards, and therefore your approach would be more or less the same? I mean, Gary, you have the vineyards in the most parts of the appellation. So do you irrigate very differently in the different vineyards? And if so, what drives those decisions?
Yeah, definitely. We love to stress our vines. I think we have the same growing philosophy. We stress our vines. We hopefully try not put any water in until after veraison. We generally can get into late summer without having to water. We're trying to control the balance of the vine in the vineyard by not irrigating. And, there are vineyards in the appellation that are dry farmed. Scott Caraccioli has a vineyard that's totally dry farmed. Garrett Buchenhagen has a vineyard that's totally dry farmed. So there are people, playing with different techniques.
That's really interesting. Let's talk about grapes for a second. I guess this will be my question, but Chardonnay and Pinot are the most famous grapes in Santa Lucia Highlands. But when I taste Syrahs from Santa Lucia Highlands, sometimes they're just extraordinary. And is that still hard commercially, that proposition of Syrah? Because the wines are just unbelievable sometimes.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I like Syrah a lot, but I want to say one more thing about Pinot Noir, is that Gary and I, he's the best partner I ever had. I've had some bad ones, but he's the best I ever had. Anyway, we came up with a good thing in the early '90s about selling fruit to different wineries like Peter Michael, Passion Hall, Siduri, Rohr, Capio, Bernardus. And anyway, and people say, do you guys compete? I go, no, we're like an all-star team. We compare ideas and we work together to make the best Pinot Noir. And we've really done a lot to bring up the respect of Santa Lucia Highlands. And it's been like people say, well, it was a lot of work. Or, no, it was a lot of fun. And we thank Antonio and Adam, and it's just been a great team. And the kids are now getting in it. But we'd like to show the typicity of the vineyard. And every vineyard should be identifiable. It should show its flavors. And we farm them all the same so they show themselves. And that's really important. And we love doing it.
Wow.
Jeff?
Yeah, absolutely. But, more on Syrah, we love it too. And we and a number of other growers have some planted, in small amounts. But you mentioned what it seems like a natural fit, but in terms of not seeing more, I think it's combination. There's the growing side, which is Syrah is a very late variety. So in the cool climate appellations, we often find where we have Syrah, we're more likely to encounter environmental pressure or rain before that Syrah comes off the vine. So it's usually, it's a more challenging prospect to think of growing that, which I think, may prohibit some people to venture into planting it on a larger scale. And then of course, we obviously work with, a lot of wineries from the vineyards we farm, and as well as other growers too. I think they find less Syrah, buyers in the market. There are a few, and, we sell grapes to some Syrah producers. My wife makes Cattleya Syrah. Tegan Pastelaqua makes a Syrah from the Sobranas. A few others, obviously, and they're fantastic. And we find that they're very passionate. They know exactly what they like. They find granite soils is cool climate, but it's a tough proposition because it's hard to get that, fruit ripened in their ideal conditions.
Because Syrah is much later ripening.
Yeah.
I used to make Syrah from there, and I recall one year I picked on November 10th. So yes, I mean, that type of, heading into November, it's just fortunate that there wasn't rain that particular year. But if it does get wet at the end of the year, Syrah can be out there hanging quite a bit.
So we have a question for Jeff. I used to review these wines myself, so it was a little more up to date. Now we have Josh Reynolds, speaking of teams, Gary Pizzoni. I know what that's all about. We have Josh Reynolds who reviews these wines. So I'm a little out of touch. So I'm curious, Jeff, this question from Harry Fisher, which is, how's your approach evolved with Pizzoni and Lucia? And if you could explain those two brands would be helpful.
Sure. That's a good question, I think. And in fact, I think, Antonio, that might be the first question you asked us when you came to the region a long time ago, which is a great one. So we have the two brands, Pizzoni and Lucia. It sort of evolved that way when we first started, making wine. It was, taking our Pizzoni vineyard, planted in 1982. First vintage was 1998. So it was the only wine we produced. And we were selling grapes to a number of people, so we bottled under Pizzoni. As we branched out, partnered with Gary Francioni, did other things, planted Syrah and Chardonnay, we decided that Lucia was going to represent other varieties and regions and, different stuff that way. All wines are made in the same intent and quality, just bottled under the different label. Yeah.
Well, and one little thing about Syrah is I think that, well, Gary and I made some pretty good Syrah, and the French made us knights in Châteauneuf-du-Pape because of our Syrah. Partner?
Okay, if you say so, I don't know. Sounds pretty good to me.
Gary knows.
Gary knows?
We were knighted over there.
That's great. I'm sure that was a hell of a party.
Oh, on the back.
I'm not surprised. All right.
Now it's interesting on the Châteauneuf-du-Pape thing. I'm working with Philippe Camby from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and we are making Pinot from the Soberanis vineyard together.
Wow.
So Châteauneuf has now come to Santa Lucia.
What is that going to be a separate brand, or what's the story?
Yeah, it's a new label called Beaumarchais that we started in 2019. So it's aging in barrel right now.
Wow. What about, so there's a question here I think is really interesting about climate change and the extent that it might influence a shift of thinking of clones, but I guess I would add rootstock to that. If you notice that the climate is changing, what are the, besides the obvious being irrigation, what are the tools that are available to sort of deal with that? And does this cause you to rethink clones and clonal and rootstock selection?
Absolutely. I think, we've originally, if we look at some of your original plantings, Dad, some early plantings, I see a lot of, 5C around the area, different things that have, and now I see more drought tolerant rootstocks, which is, you think more in terms of, vine sustainability, less water requirement for those rootstocks. I see, different things like that going on in terms of what people are looking at. And of course that you could influence your water requirements from the vine and also ripening windows for vines based on what rootstocks you use. Absolutely.
I mean, that's a topic for an entire discussion, I think. Yeah. So there's a really great question from Kevin. I think one of the I think the challenges, I think, for Santa Lucia Highlands is that on the one hand, there are a lot of very high quality labels making wines from the fruit, but let's say for the wine tourist, the person who wants to go visit the area, there's not necessarily a whole lot of places in the area to go taste these wines. You can taste them in a lot of other places, but I remember the first time I went out to, I think it was to Gary Francioni's house. I mean, the directions were like super specific because you thought there was no way in hell I could get there on my own, which is probably true. But, it's not like it's not like other parts of the world where it's a little, bit more to the eye, sort of like, now here I am, sort of this sort of region of kind of appears out of nowhere. And then there you are in the middle of it. So how does somebody who wants to learn more get out there to see these vineyards? What is the way that somebody who like maybe looks at this map and says, I want to go see this land, what's available?
Well, you're right, Antonio. There's probably 5 or 6 tasting rooms within the appellation: Ododana, Manzoni, Pisano, Pomerode, Hahn, Rath. But there's about 20 wine tasting rooms in Carmel, and in Carmel Valley, about another dozen. And, with the COVID going on, they're actually opening up this Friday, tomorrow. So hopefully everybody gets rejuvenated and gets back on track.
Yeah, that's a beautiful area also to go see.
Yeah, and it's maybe 45 minutes, an hour. You head over there. It's not all that far. I remember there used to be a billboard on 101 that said, "It's happening in Soledad." And I could never figure out what it was because there's nothing that's happening in Soledad unless maybe there's a prison break every now and then. And that's exciting. But other than that, it is people many times say they really want to go see where the farming happens. They really want to be tied to the earth. And that's what I do love about the Santa Lucia Highlands, is that the people that are there, they grew up on this land. I mean, it's Gary said, he's been there multiple generations. The Pizzoni family's been there since the 1800s as well. These people grew up on the land. I've had the privilege of getting to know the Pizzoni, Gary's parents, Gary Franchione's mom. You get to know all of these people, and this is their land, and they take care of it. It's special to them, but it's just not a big touristy area. You do go over to Carmel and into Carmel Valley to really taste the wines in many cases.
You know, I'd like to add too to that, as far as the generational families, that's who we are. I mean, we're happy. Garrett and I are getting a little old here, but we've got, you know, our kids, my son Adam and Nick, Jeff and Mark. You've got Jason Smith, you got Teresa Franchione, Scott Caraccioli, Christian McIntyre. You've got all these Charlie Wagner and Joey Wagner. You've got all this next generation coming up to carry on our legacy.
Yeah, there's a lot of
energy. You said we're getting a little old.
You're not getting old to me, because if you're getting old, that means I'm getting old. So you're not getting old. You can't use that yet. This is a great question from Josh. I think I might know the answer, but it's a great question. How often do you get together to taste all of each other's wines? You know, when you sell fruit to a number of people, I imagine it must be very fun to line these wines up. Do you ever do like a blind tasting and say, we want to taste all the Gary's Vineyard, you know, Pinots, or all the Rosella's Pinots, or the Syrah Mar? You know, how often does that happen? How does it work?
Whenever they call me.
Yeah, Antonio, we do. We evaluate wineries every year. It's we always do it a couple times a year together. But you know, we also go out to the wineries and barrel taste their wines, just to, like Gary said, to learn from everybody and see what they're doing and share these ideas. But we want to keep everybody up on the same level of quality.
And I know in other parts of California, there's sort of a, if you feel like the wines aren't good enough, you may decide not to sell fruit. Does that happen very often? I have to ask you at least one hard question. Come on.
No, it has happened, and I'm not afraid of it. And we went to the winery. They were barrel fermenting Pinot Noir, and it got stuck, and it was just not good. And so we just simply asked them not to put Gary's on their label, and they agreed, and they did. I assume they did an SLH or Central Coast or something. I don't know. But then we went back, and they did the same thing the next year. So we kind of had to part ways.
And Antonio, there's three important things for me with our winemakers. You have to be my friend, make good wine, and pay the bill. The third one's the hard one.
That's always really important, and a lot of people get that wrong, don't they?
They learn from us.
I bet. I wouldn't want to upset you,
No.
for sure. I want to answer a question here about when this map is going to be done. And I'll show you what this is a St. Helena map, but this is what this map is going to look like when it's done. So you've shown you the front. So we call these maps narrative maps. And if you can see here, you can see what the back of one of our maps looks like. There's introductory text, which would be over here. There's a highlight of the important vineyard sites, especially those that are vineyard designate that a person buying a wine is going to recognize. And then we always have a few 3D callouts. So what you're seeing now is the front of the map, which we believe, we hope, fingers crossed, is like 99.9% done. There's always something, you know, but the back part is the part that is slightly interrupted by this pandemic. Not too much, but it'll be done when both sides are done. And, you know, we believe a lot in the context. So it's not just, you know, what the vineyards look like, you know, on the front of the map, but the back of the map is all of these things that we're talking about this afternoon. The influence of the ocean, of the fog, the soils, northwest to southeast, all of that is what gets captured on the back. So let's see what else there is, because we have time for a few more questions. Let's see. Does anybody have anything that we haven't talked about? Any of the panelists? Is there anything that you want to address that we haven't asked, or that?
I have one quick thing I want to say is,
Yeah.
when I was in college, I studied psychology and have my degree in it. And my father wanted me to be a farmer. And he was so mad, he goes, "What the hell you gonna do with psychology?" I said, "Talk to the grapes."
Seems to have worked pretty well.
Well, they listen.
You're not playing music for your vineyards like at night?
No, I can't sing that good.
Well, it can be recorded.
You know, Antonio, one of the questions that was asked, and it was interesting, I read a book called The Winemaker by Richard Peterson. And back in that day, the most planted grape in the area was Riesling. And I know there is still a little bit of Riesling, but not very much at all. But that has kind of gone away. But it just shows you how cool the area can be, and was the fact that Riesling was what was planted there at the time. I think Dan Lee might still make one at Morgan over there.
We even today, you know, not even Santa Lucia Highlands because it's such a small AVA, but Monterey County as a whole has some of the largest Riesling plantings in California, in coastal California at least.
Yeah, and that's a great book, Adam, Richard
Yes.
Peterson's book, because, you know, I'm not sure exactly how old he is, but he's at a place in life where he can just say whatever he wants to say and it doesn't matter. And you'll rarely read a book. A lot of it's focused on Napa Valley and more commercial style of wine, but you'll very rarely get such a unvarnished look at the industry. And if you really want to know how things, I mean, obviously things aren't like that now, but if you wanted to get a sense of what a period of time was like, what a great book to read, right?
It is. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. Great. Well, you know, we've got time for maybe one or two more questions, but, you know, I just go back to the panelists to see if there's anything, there's something that is, that we need to talk about. I'll answer this question from Andrew about the map being digital. So this map right now is on a PDF, and, you know, later, you know, it'll be in possibly in other formats. But right now we're dealing with the PDF. It does take a little bit to render, but hopefully it looks okay when we show it. And if not, you know, we'll just improve. That's, you know, we're constantly in a state of trying to get better.
And Antonio,
Yeah.
It's really important that everyone in this group, and well, there's plenty of us in Santa Lucia Highlands, is we're all Pinot Noir crazy. And we're so passionate, we do everything we can to make the best Pinot Noir possible. And I'm glad my kids and my friends are the same way.
Well, I can tell. I mean, I think that the passion is fantastic. It's very evident. It was evident to me the first time I went to taste at your ranch.
Well, come on back.
I have to, because, you know, the problem with when you do these maps like this is the more you learn about something, the more you realize how little you know. And every time we do a panel discussion like this with the map, I'm glad we haven't printed them yet, because I'm like, God, I can't believe I haven't explained this or haven't articulated this. And so these sessions are actually really helpful, even for me and for Alessandro, because I don't want to annoy you too much, because we do want to publish these really quickly, but there's just so much to know. And it's such a rich onion to sort of unpeel and to look at the layers. And for me, it's just, I'm endlessly fascinated, you know, every time I go and I see something new. So thank you. It's fantastic.
And it means a lot to us too, as was talked about. I mean, the region is very much a region of farmers and growers. So, you know, we don't do necessarily a lot to do a lot of exposure. So it means a lot to have, you know, such a detailed, specific, elegant map done for the region. Everyone's very excited about it.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask you one last question, because it's very topical right now, which is alcohol in the Santa Lucia Highlands. How important is that? And how hard is it to get sort of ripening that's both physiological, that's the skins and the seeds for people who are watching, versus the sugars? Is it a big challenge, or is it because it's a cooler region that it's going to be sort of moderate by today's standards anyway?
I think Adam could tell it pretty good.
Well,
All right.
For me, the issue has always been the acidity, because the acidity is so high. That means that sometimes you have to wait later to pick. And so consequently, you may end up that way with higher alcohol just to get the acidity low enough so you can go through malolactic fermentation. That can be the challenge. I think as the vines are getting older, again, that has been somewhat less of an issue. The vines tend to put out a little more fruit. They ripen a little bit more slowly. And then I've been using more whole cluster. And I know, Jeff, you've been doing a bit more with whole cluster as well. That also causes the pH to go up a little bit, helps mitigate some of that acidity. So sometimes we can pick a little bit earlier now. And in combination with the whole cluster, it helps keep alcohol in balance and helps mitigate some of that really high acid that you get.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. You know, we're up against our time limit. I know we could talk about this forever. Hopefully, the next time that we do a tasting with this map, we'll have some wine and we can get really into the specifics of vineyards and vinification. There's questions about barrels and all that stuff. We'll do that later because in another session, because this map, I think everybody watching knows there's a lot of conversations still to be had. So I want to thank our panelists, Gary Francione, Adam Lee, Jeff Pizzoni, Gary Pizzoni, everybody from the Santa Lucia Highlands who's welcomed Alessandro and I. A lot of the farmers that you mentioned at the beginning, Gary, who took us around, showed us the vineyards, answered all of our questions. I want to thank everybody who's been involved with the creation of this map. And I can't wait to show it to you when it's completely done. But for now, thank you. Cheers. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Antonio.
Everyone for your questions. Bye-bye.
Bye.